connecting people, building communities, helping clients to build multi-generational wealth through real estate.
Today, we have the privilege of having Bobby Vakili with us again. Bobby is the founder of Vakili Law Group, a boutique law firm located in Thornhill, serving the greater Toronto area. They are focused on real estate law, private mortgages, business law, and wills and estates. We have tried, in a situation that I'm just bringing to your attention, we have tried. Landlord has shown every way possible to cooperate and see what could work, even giving 2 months rent free, not even a month free, and that the tenant can find a place that would be more suitable. But then not only the tenant is not paying the rent or has used last month's rent towards one of the months that she has not paid. So there is no collaboration. There is no basis of solution, finding solution that would be workable. When. Right. So in this case, I would say that, it all depends on how long it would take for the tribunal to respond and to resolve the problem that somehow would help both parties. Because sometimes I feel tenants, they don't realize if they have financial difficulties and they cannot afford to make the payment, then they have to look at other solutions. They have to find situation that would be long-term, fitting their needs.
Right.
And that's sometimes I think that the tenants, they don't realize that, they don't see that.
Yeah, I mean, in that situation, if the landlord has made all these concessions and has agreed to waive rent for a couple of months and, they still haven't been able to find a solution, that's important. I would make sure that's all documented. So when you go to the tribunal and you have your hearing, there's a full record, a complete record regarding all the compromises that the landlord has made. And in that situation, I would expect the tribunal to order the eviction of the tenant.
Okay, thank you, Bobby. So we have covered many scenarios where the landlord can terminate the agreement early. Thank you for explaining all these details with patience. Yes. Now we are going to cover when can a tenant terminate the lease early. Can you tell us more about this situation?
Yes. So this also comes up frequently in my practice, and I'm sure you probably hear it from your clients as well. Obviously, the easiest way to do is when both parties mutually agree. If the tenant wants to assign the lease to someone else, that's another way that you can terminate early in the event the landlord is not cooperating and is sort of acting in bad faith. Obviously, if an order is issued by the Landlord-Tenant Board, that's another reason. If, let's say, the landlord is withholding vital services to the unit, that would be another reason the tenant could terminate the lease early, and the landlord may also be responsible for damages that the tenant may have suffered. So there's a whole host of reasons, but those are probably the most common.
Okay, thank you, Bobby. We have a scenario actually. We have a landlord, we help them to find a tenant, and the agreement was 1-year lease, and now the tenant requested to terminate the lease early. Let's say the end of October is the end of the term, and the tenant wants to move out at the end of July. And in a situation like that, what's the responsibility of the tenant or the landlord? Can tenant say that I'm not going to make the payment of the rent and I'm going to leave early simply because I've been relocating or I found a different property in a different location? Can landlord say that you can leave any time, and if I find a tenant, then I would compensate? If not, I would not. Can you tell us more about a situation like this?
Yeah, so in that situation, as long as both parties agree, then they can amend the lease any way they see fit. But if the landlord does not accept the termination notice, which typically in a yearly lease, the tenant would be required to provide 60 days notice. And if the landlord does not accept the early termination notice of the tenant, excuse me, the landlord, the tenant in that instance should try to assign the lease. So that's another way that they can deal with this issue, by assigning the lease.
What if they don't have anybody to assign? What if the tenant moves out, let's say the end of July, and they already paid the rent for August, because the rent was, by the way, in this scenario, the rent was paid upfront, full year upfront. So they have the month of August, September, and October, and we come to the market and we rent the unit, let's say for August or September. Can landlord collect two rentals for the that overlap period, or is the landlord responsible to pay back the tenant?
In that situation, if they've paid the rent up front, I would see no reason why the landlord would not allow the tenant to move out in the first place, because there's no real loss to the landlord. Now,
the tenant wants refund.
Oh, the tenant wants a refund. I see.
Yeah.
Well, if the tenant wants a refund, then they should go and actively find someone else to take over the lease and assign the lease.
And if they don't find anybody to assign the lease to, and we come to the market, let's say after the tenants move out, the end of July, and we find somebody who wants to occupy the unit, let's say in September, can landlords collect the money for the month of September, October, while they have already collected upfront from the existing tenant till the end of October, or should they refund the money?
No, they should refund the tenant. There's a legal principle known as unjust enrichment, and in that instance, the tenant could make an unjust enrichment claim against the landlord. So yeah, there's no real loss suffered by the landlord, so there's no reason for the landlord to refuse to return those monies.
So long as we come to the market, if we have a tenant who is going to occupy the unit before, let's say, the end of October, then landlord must pay back the rent that was collected.
Correct.
Okay.
If the landlord finds a new tenant to occupy the premises and enters into a lease agreement prior to the previous lease expiring, any overlap, should be refunded to the previous tenant.
Okay, beautiful. That clarifies a lot of things. Thank you, Bobby, for that. So we now know how the tenants can terminate the agreement.
Right.
So can you tell us also about the changes that have been made to the Residential Tenancy Act? Can you tell us more about that?
Sorry, what changes are you referring to?
Are there any changes to Residential Tenancy Act that we need to be aware?
Yes, there is a new bill that is being, I think, proposed, and the fines that are being proposed are all being increased against landlords. Especially, apparently, there's a common problem with renovations where landlords evict tenants under the guise of renovation, and then don't allow the tenant to move back in at the same rate. So those fines are being increased. Most of the changes that are being considered and will be implemented will benefit tenants.
And what is the fine amount?
I believe it's being increased from $50,000 to $100,000.
Wow.
For a landlord that is an individual. If the landlord is
$50,000. So that is the case that the tenant wants to renovate a unit, and it was before $50,000 if they would not allow the tenant to move back with the rent that the tenant was paying. Now that fine is $100,000.
Yeah, $100,000 fine for the landlord.
If, let's say, this is a really very good topic. We have a scenario, landlord has rented the main floor and the basement to a tenant, and now the landlord wants to renovate the basement. And he actually reached out to the tenant asking whether they can cooperate, allowing the landlord to renovate the basement and make it a legal basement apartment. The tenant says no, they do not want any more interruption in their life, in their lifestyle, daily lifestyle. Is that something tenant can do, or is it somehow any solution for the landlord to renovate and bring some kind of additional rental income?
Yeah, I mean, if is the landlord's intent to lease the basement apartment to a different individual?
Yes.
Oh, to a different individual. And
because the basement, in fact, does not need even to be part of the main floor rent. And so it can be definitely rented separately, or at least he wants to make sure that he has done all the work needed, required, that when the time comes, he can generate rental income from the basement.
I think that's a tricky situation. You would have to look at the original lease agreement, and as long as the original lease agreement with the existing tenant excludes the basement, then it's probably doable. But if the original lease with the tenant does not exclude access to the basement, you can't now all of a sudden unilaterally tell them, oh, I'm basically denying you access to the basement because I want to rent it to a new tenant.
So definitely we need to verify the agreement. And on the other hand, if let's say the basement is not included as part of the agreement and the tenant refuses to encounter further renovation for the basement, can landlord enforce the termination of the agreement in a situation like that?
Yeah, if the tenant is refusing entry to the premises in order for the landlord, obviously the landlord has rights to inspect the property, and if the basement apartment or the basement is not included as part of the original lease, then again, the tenant would have no basis to refuse entry to the landlord into the basement. So that would so that would be a grounds to seek eviction of the tenant because he's interfering with the landlord's property.
So inspecting the property is definitely different than renovating. So if they say they have no problem, if the tenant said they have no problem on inspection, but they have problem on major renovation, is that any way that the landlord can enforce the termination of the agreement?
Yeah, the tenant would have no basis to refuse renovation to the basement, so long as it doesn't interfere with the tenant's main, the main floor space where he's currently occupying and he's currently paying rent. As long as it doesn't interfere and no vital services are terminated, like water or heating, as long as none of those issues arise, the tenant would have no basis to interfere with the landlord's renovation of the basement.
What if it's noise, which is going to be a disturbance for the tenant? Can they say, no, we don't agree because of the noise disturbance?
I don't think so. I don't think that would be a successful argument. He may be entitled to some small sort of monetary damages for the inconvenience of noise and whatnot, but for him to refuse altogether, I don't think that would be upheld by the tribunal.
Okay. Bobby, we covered a lot of scenarios that definitely would be valuable to both landlords and tenants. Is there anything else that you have encountered in your line of work that you would like to share with us?
No, I think, like you said, we've covered a lot of different areas. One thing that, in sort of preparation for this that I did find interesting was if a landlord fails to respond to an assignment request by the tenant, landlord has essentially 7 days to respond. And if the landlord fails to respond to the tenant's request, the tenant may terminate the lease by providing 30 days notice. So that's
assignment.
yeah.
Assignment is serious. What if if landlord is not in town and that notice is given and landlord simply is unable to respond, how that work?
I think as long as there's some type of reasonable explanation as to why a response wasn't made, there may be some leniency. But if the landlord just refuses to respond or ignores it deliberately, and if the tenant has made repeated requests, then obviously the tenant would have a right to terminate the lease in that circumstance. The real thing to keep in mind here is that when a tenant does make a request to assign, you have to take it seriously and respond. Because if you don't, the landlord's rights can be prejudiced and the landlord's lease can be voided.
So, Bobby, here I have another question. Is there any difference? Can you tell us the difference between assignment and sublease?
Yeah, I think, yes. Assignment is when you assign the lease all together to a new tenant and the existing tenant no longer has any responsibilities. And a sublease is essentially when the original tenant will be returning to the lease and the new subtenant will pay the original tenant, who will in turn pay the landlord the rent amount. And the idea is because, in the sublease situation, that subtenant is returning to the lease. So there's no actual formal assignment because they will be returning prior to the lease expiration. And so the subtenant will pay the original tenant and the original tenant will pay the landlord.
Is subleasing legal?
It is legal. I mean, you do need to still obtain the consent of the landlord, but the landlord can't arbitrarily withhold their consent.
So if we don't have any clause in the agreement saying no sublease, then the tenant can sublease. But if there is any actual clause saying no sublease, then the tenant cannot sublease. Is that correct?
I don't think you can prevent a tenant from subleasing or assigning, to be honest. I don't think that term would be upheld by the court.
Wow. So even if there is a clause, no sublease, I understand for assignment.
Right.
That if they find somebody, then the landlord cannot say no.
Right.
Or they have to respond within 7 days. What's the reason they say no? Can they say no?
They can say no. Obviously, they can refuse, but there has to be a reason for it. Like, the credit worthiness, or the person doesn't have a stable job, or whatever it may be. But if it's an arbitrary reason, then no, that's not good. That's going to look badly on the landlord, and the landlord may have a difficult time explaining himself in court.
Yeah, I just feel that there is a lot of law protecting the tenants. Unfortunately, not enough law protecting the landlord, which makes it very difficult for the landlords, especially small landlords. They have one investment property, they just want to build wealth, and here we are. If one tenant is not making the payment or is not really following the rules, then I guess landlord does not have much of an option. Anything that we discussed today, from having a dog when landlord did not want to have a dog, or not subleasing, then tenant brought somebody, not disclosing. These really are realities. These things are happening. The question how we can communicate in a way that would make it workable for both landlord and tenant, for having a very, very amicable relationship. At the end, it's a human relationship. Landlords and tenants, they need to work together. And these are the situations that we are encountering.
Oh, I agree. I receive a lot of similar complaints from landlords who are very frustrated by the process and by the limited rights that they have, even where terms such as, having the tenant responsible for cutting the grass or the snow removal, those types of terms, like I said, are not enforceable when the tenant simply does not pay rent. And then it can take up to a year to get a tribunal hearing. So there's a lot of frustration, and I hear a lot of this from landlords, but unfortunately, that's the current landscape that we're in right now. And hopefully the government has, sort of, I think they do appreciate there is a problem. And from what I hear, they're increasing their budget by $5 million is earmarked for them. And they're supposed to hire a lot more staff to deal with all the backlog issues.
Hopefully that problem would be solved pretty soon. Bobby, we appreciate so much your time today. You have been an amazing help. I'm sure that landlords and tenants who are going to listen to this podcast series, they are going to enjoy having some answers that was shared by you graciously. Is there anything else you would like to cover today?
No, thank you for having me, Mitra. Always a pleasure seeing you. And look forward to the next one.
Pleasure. See you next time.
Okay, take care. Bye-bye.
Take care.
Connecting people, building communities, helping clients to build multi-generational wealth through real estate.